So, in a very simple way of explaining it, cattle farming contributes a lot to global warming because cows belong to a group of animals called ruminants. And ruminants, they have this basic property where they produce methane gas in their digestive tracts. And they burp out that methane gas and it gets into the atmosphere. And that's bad because methane gas is a very powerful greenhouse gas, much more powerful than CO2. And therefore there's this basic consensus among climate scientists that cattle farming and the consumption of beef and dairy products are contributing a lot to global warming. However, there's a bunch of different groups of people who want to dispute that fact. Chief among them, of course, is the beef industry and the feed industry, who have a financial incentive of keeping things as they are and to discredit as much as possible this connection between cattle farming and climate change. But then there's also private individuals who may have a deep emotional commitment to the goodness of eating meat and who don't want to have the steaks on their plate be connected with this whole climate change thing, which in a way is very understandable. And then, of course, as always, you have a bunch of crackpots who think climate change is a hoax and climate scientists are out to get you or whatever. So you've got this very diverse group of people all invested in disputing this connection between cattle farming and climate change. And they use a bunch of different arguments and talking points. Some of them are very sophisticated and scientific and very hard to debunk, and others are very stupid. And they're all often mixed together in a sort of rapid fire, just throw anything at the wall kind of way. So today I don't want to try to debunk all of it. We'd be here all day. What I want to do is just take one single talking point that is used very, very often and explain and debunk it. My hope is that when you encounter this talking point in the future, you will be very quickly able to recognize the false logic and the misleading framing of it, and maybe will be able to reconsider the reliability of the person making such arguments. So, without further ado, let's get into it. The basic argument goes like this. The methane from the cows is part of a natural biogenic carbon cycle. This is true. However, the implication of that statement that is often left unstated is that the methane is therefore not a big problem. So they're saying something factually true and implying something that is false. To see what I mean by this, let's imagine an example. Imagine a rattlesnake comes up to you. You get scared and take a step back, but it tells you, don't worry. Snake venom is 100% natural. That is a factually correct statement. Snake venom is in fact 100% natural. However, the implication of that statement is, come here and let me bite you, which is not so great advice. So it is in fact very possible to state something true while implying something false. Now let's dive one level deeper. The argument relies on two basic pillars, with the first one being that while fossil methane is bad, biogenic methane from the natural carbon cycle is not so bad. Here, a distinction is being made between two types of methane. First, we've got fossil methane from deep underground, over 100 million years old. It can be extracted in the form of natural gas through processes like fracking. And then the other kind of methane is biogenic methane, originating not deep underground, but from nature and the natural carbon cycle. And the argument is that fossil methane is much worse than biogenic methane. Now, let's watch a couple of examples of this argument being made. And just to be clear, in the clips you're about to see, They do, in other parts of the videos, acknowledge the fact that methane is a stronger greenhouse gas than CO2. But then they still present the fact that it's biogenic methane as if it were relevant, which it is not. This first clip is from the YouTube channel of Alltech, an American company with operations in animal feed and meat.
Now, the problem is that simplicity is then applied to animal production, which becomes a problem, because animal production is part of a carbon cycle. The carbon cycle is simply the way that carbon moves through the system.
The next one is from the CLEAR Center at UC Davis, a research center with deep financial ties to the meat and feed industry. According to internal University of California documents obtained by Unearthed and reviewed by the New York Times, the CLEAR Center receives nearly all of its funding from the animal agriculture industry and has worked with industry representatives to coordinate communication priorities and strategies.
These carbon molecules are the same carbon molecules that were in the plant the animal ate, which was pulled from the atmosphere by the plant and is now back in the atmosphere. It's recycled carbon.
Biogenic carbon is different because it's going through a cycle. That's very different from fossil carbon, which goes through a one-way street from the bottom up into the air.
The man you just saw is the head of the CLEAR Center, Frank Mitloehner. In this next clip, he is speaking on the YouTube channel of ILSI. ILSI is a non-profit organization whose members include companies like Pepsi, Syngenta and McDonald's. And although they describe themselves as a non-profit organization, they've been criticized for basically acting like a lobbying group.
That methane gas that's belched out or coming from the manure is not new carbon added to the atmosphere. It is not additional carbon added to the atmosphere, but it is a recycled form of carbon, because that carbon on the right side here in the methane originates on the left side from atmospheric CO2.
This last clip is from the documentary film Sacred Cow, which, in my view, is basically a PR piece for cattle farming.
It's rain, and the CO2 is taken up by plants for photosynthesis. Even though this methane is going up in the air, we're also building carbon below ground. It's offsetting the methane that's going up anyway. It's a natural biogenic cycle. However, when we talk about fossil fuels bringing up deep carbon and methane from well below the topsoil down into the Earth's crust, that's a completely different entity. And that is carbon that's ancient, that's coming from deep below ground and being put in the atmosphere and isn't in balance from a natural biological cycle.
It's true. The methane from cows is biogenic methane, not fossil methane. However, when reassessing the environmental impact of cattle farming, this fact is almost completely irrelevant. And it's wrong to suggest that because this methane is biogenic, it's somehow not harmful. But let's not jump to conclusions. There is a true version of this argument. However, in the clips you just heard, this argument is being used in situations where it doesn't apply. So let's look at an example where this argument would be true by looking at the CO2 that we breathe out. So when we breathe in oxygen from the air, which we then convert to CO2 in our cells, and then we breathe out CO2. So with CO2 being a greenhouse gas, you could say that our breath is contributing to global warming. But this isn't true. Our breath is not contributing to global warming. Because there's a difference between burning coal, which adds new CO2 from deep in the ground into the atmosphere, and our breath, which is simply returning CO2 to the atmosphere that was already there originally. The carbon from the CO2 that we breathe out, it's from our bodies. And our bodies, they get their atoms from the food that we eat. And the food gets the carbon through photosynthesis. So plants doing photosynthesis take CO2 out of the air, then we eat the plant, the carbon gets into our body, and when we breathe out, the CO2 is being returned to the atmosphere and the natural cycle is completed. This is the true version of the biogenic argument. However, something different is happening with cows. Cows, they take in carbon by eating plants, but then they don't breathe out CO2. They convert some of the CO2 into methane, which is a much stronger greenhouse gas. So while we humans, with our breath, are taking a CO2 and returning a CO2, cows are taking a CO2 and returning methane. That's the problem. So I hope you can see now why saying it's not fossil methane, it's biogenic methane is somehow besides the point. And just for fun, let's watch a clip of Alex Jones making a very similar argument and making a fool of himself as always.
They try to convince us that cows' methane is bad. You actually look at the carbon equation, it all turns right back into the gases it came from. It's a good gas. But again, if the cows are bad, well, what else releases methane? We do. We're the carbon that they want to reduce. They want to teach us to hate ourselves.
In the beginning of the clip, Alex Jones uses the "it's biogenic methane" argument, which we just saw doesn't apply here. He then claims that humans emit methane as well. This is misleading. The amount of methane emitted from the human body is so small it's irrelevant. Out of all anthropogenic methane emissions, only less than 0.1% come from the human body. Additionally, a single cow emits about 1,500 times more methane than a single human. Now let's get to the second pillar of the argument. It says that methane emissions aren't such a big problem because methane lasts for only 10 to 12 years in the atmosphere before it breaks down and gets recycled. It's true. While CO2 can last in the atmosphere for hundreds or even over 1,000 years, methane breaks down after only 10 to 12 years. It goes in atmospheric oxidation and is turned into CO2 and water. So 1 ton of methane heats the atmosphere about 100 times stronger than 1 ton of CO2. However, the methane lasts for much shorter time in the atmosphere. So how do we compare these two? Coming up with metrics on how to compare different greenhouse gases with different lifetimes is not a trivial task. One of the metrics that are used are the so-called GWP values, and we'll try to understand them right now. GWP stands for global warming potential. And what we can see here is a table of common greenhouse gases and their GWP values. I took this from the Wikipedia article on global warming potentials, so that's where you can find it if you want to look it up. Now, the first thing that we can notice is that all these common greenhouse gases have several GWP values each. One over a 20-year time span, one over 100 years, and one over 500 years. Now, what we are interested in right now is non-fossil biogenic methane. So when we look over a time span of 20 years, we can see that 1 ton of methane adds 81 times more heat to the atmosphere than 1 ton of CO2. However, if we look at it over 100 years, then the value drops. Now it's only 27 times more. And for 500 years, the value is even lower. So why does this value drop? It has something to do with the fact that methane breaks down in the atmosphere after, on average, only 12 years. So it would make sense that the majority of the heating occurs early in the first 20 years, and after that, less and less heating is added. We will explore this in a little bit more detail later, but firstly, I want to direct your attention to one other thing. We can see here in this table that methane is being mentioned twice, once for fossil methane and once for biogenic methane. Now, why is there a distinction being made here? The reason is that after methane breaks down in the atmosphere, it turns into CO2. And for this CO2, it's actually relevant whether we're talking about fossil methane or biogenic methane, because if we're talking about fossil methane, the CO2 that it turns into is new CO2 added to the atmosphere that adds additional heating to the atmosphere. However, if it's biogenic methane, the CO2 that it turns into is not new CO2, so we are not counting it in the calculation. Now, you can see that the differences here are actually pretty small, especially if we're looking at 20 and 100 years. And I think this here summarizes perfectly why I think using the fact that it's biogenic methane to minimize the impact of cattle farming is a misleading argument, because you're actually looking at a difference of 81 to 83 or a difference of 27 to 30. So not a big difference at all. Now let's explore a little bit more deeply what the GWP value actually means and how it's calculated. And to do that, we can simply follow what we see on this graph here. The yellow curve here concerns methane, while the blue curve concerns CO2. What we're seeing here is the time integral of the radiative forcing, or to say it more simply, the heat that has been added to the atmosphere up to that time. Keep in mind that the yellow curve is actually 10 times larger than it appears. It has been shrunken down 10 times, so both curves can fit into the same image. So the methane curve and the CO2 curve only intersect after thousands and thousands of years. At the point here where they appear to intersect, the methane curve is actually still 10 times higher. Now, CH4, methane, is a very strong greenhouse gas, so a lot of heat is being added early on into the atmosphere. However, methane breaks down, and after 100 years, basically no more methane from the original methane is left, and no additional heat is being added afterwards. CO2, on the other hand, is a much weaker greenhouse gas, but it stays in the atmosphere for hundreds of years and is continuously adding heat to the atmosphere. Now, the black curve here, that's our actual GWP value for methane. And what it is the yellow curve divided by the blue curve. We're basically doing a comparison between methane and CO2. Now, you can see early on, the comparison between methane and CO2 is largely in favor of methane, with a very large value of around 80. Now, when we wait 100 years and go to GWP 100, we can see that the value is much lower, around 28, because while methane has stopped heating after 20 years, CO2 has continuously been adding heat. That's how the GWP value for different timeframes is actually calculated. Now, climate scientists, they know everything that I just talked about. It is their job after all. But if somebody wanted to use the short lifetime of methane to minimize the environmental impacts of cattle farming, they'd have to suggest that the short lifetime of methane isn't being considered when the environmental impact of cattle farming is assessed. They'd have to make the case that the short lifetime isn't being taken into account. Now let's once again watch a couple of examples of these arguments.
And a small fraction of that carbon comes off as methane. Now that's the one we're worried about, obviously. But what a lot of people don't consider is that that methane only hangs around in the environment for about 10 to 12 years. It is then broken down in the atmosphere and returns as carbon dioxide. So again, there is no net contribution of carbon to the system in that process.
Current standards say 1 molecule of methane is as strong as 28 molecules of carbon dioxide over 100 years. And that's true. But methane doesn't live for 100 years. It's a short-lived climate pollutant, staying in our atmosphere for about 10 years before it's destroyed.
In the clip you just saw, the GWP 100 value is being shown and then minimized with the comment, but methane doesn't live for 100 years. Well, yes, but that fact was already factored into the GWP 100 value. That's why the GWP 100 is only 28, while the GW20 value is around 80. Let's watch this next clip.
But it's important to know that there is, and remember that, an atmospheric removal process of methane. An atmospheric removal process of methane. And this GWP 100 unit that's currently being used is not taking that into consideration in the way it should. GWP 100 acts as if methane will only produced but not destroyed, when indeed that is wrong.
No. Taking into account the atmospheric removal process of methane is the very point of the GWP 100 value. At this point, I've basically said everything that I wanted to say, so I'll finish the video now with some closing thoughts. I guess the next video that I could make, sort of as a logical continuation of this one, would be a video about GWP star values. They are basically an alternative metric to the regular GWP values that we saw in this video. And although I don't think they're really important to understanding the issue of cattle farming and methane emissions, I do think they're rhetorically important. Because the clips you just saw, where they tried to argue against the validity of the GWP 100 metric, they did that because they want to argue in favor of the GWP star metric. And the way it works, just to show it in a simple example, is if you have a cattle herd of a constant size, that cattle herd delivers a temperature increase to the atmosphere that is constant. But if you have a car fleet of a constant size, that delivers a temperature increase to the atmosphere that is growing. So the way that GWP star works is that it doesn't take into account any temperature increases that are constant. And therefore a cattle farm would get equivalent emissions of 0. So you can very clearly see why the beef industry would very much like us to use this metric to evaluate their farms. Now, as a purely scientific or mathematical concept, I've got nothing against GWP star values. It's a valid metric, it just shows something different from regular GWP values, which is fine. But what I do have a problem with is when people argue in favor of the GWP star value by misrepresenting the GWP 100 value, like suggesting that it doesn't take into account the atmospheric removal process of methane when it obviously does, or making irrelevant points about biogenic methane to confuse the issue. So yeah, I think adopting GWP star in everyday discussions or on national level emissions accounting would be a terrible idea for many reasons. And I could make a dedicated video about that if that is something you guys would be interested in. On the other hand, it is kind of a niche issue, and I feel like I've already adequately shown in this video that the arguments promoted by the beef industry don't really hold up to scrutiny when you look at them too closely. So yeah, another topic that I thought of making a video about was the green transition of the energy-heavy industry. That could be stuff like green ammonia production or carbon-neutral steel manufacturing. Yeah, so if you guys have any other ideas or questions about this video, feel free to leave a comment, and also like the video, subscribe to the channel, all that good stuff. Bye-bye.